Family law is about people, not paperwork. Trusted by thousands of UK firms, Leap's legal software gives family lawyers a single, fully integrated platform to scale your practice, stay compliant, and deliver better client outcomes. Learn more at leap.co.uk.
You're listening to the Today's Family Lawyer podcast, the leading source of daily news and insight for family law practitioners in England and Wales. Sign up to our free weekly newsletter at todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk and subscribe to hear all the latest news and views from across the family law sector. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello and welcome along to the latest Today's Family Lawyer podcast. Today we welcome on business manager at Northgene, Charlotte Haskayne, to talk about DNA testing, talk about paternity testing, thinking about the sorts of cases that come across the lawyer's desk and when they might look to instruct the sort of services that you and Northgene provide, Charlotte. Great to have you on the podcast. Really appreciate you joining.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start out with a little bit about yourself. Who are you, Charlotte, and what do you do?
So my name is Charlotte, like you said. I am the business manager of Northgene. So my core responsibilities include the operational management of the service and of the team, a financial oversight of the business as a whole, and then maintaining and growing our external relationships. So for those who don't know, Northgene is a Ministry of Justice and Home Office accredited DNA testing laboratory. We carry out parentage tests as directed by the civil courts in England and Wales under Section 20 of the Family Reform Act 1969. Northgene, we've been around for over 30 years and we've been providing DNA testing to the public, to local authorities and to solicitors through accredited services. So historically, people probably would have known Northgene as being a small company based up in Newcastle. However, a few years back, we got acquired by a bigger company called Fortuna, who have really revolutionised Northgene and all of the services that we provide. I'd say we're no longer the underdog of the DNA testing industry, and we're now at the forefront of it. We became the second lab in the UK to be accredited for prenatal paternity testing, and now we're offering one of the fastest and most competitive legal DNA testing services in the UK.
One of the things we're going to talk about today is some of the ethical considerations of testing, which is not something that we've particularly touched on in the course of the podcast before. But let's start for the uninitiated with what testing involves. What are the services that you provide? In my head, I always think about those episodes of CSI New York or CSI Miami, but I suspect it really isn't quite as glamorous as the TV makes it out to be.
Yeah, and no, I guess. I think anyone who works in a laboratory environment, you can't help but cringe the way they portray people working in the lab on TV, when in reality you're covered head to toe in PPE and you're dealing with hundreds of samples at one time. But I would say the reasons people needing a DNA test are normally what you'd see on TV, because that's just how life works. My favourite film is Bridget Jones's Baby, but I'd say it's not as accurate in reflecting how easy and simple it is to get a prenatal paternity test. So in the film, she didn't have the option of getting a non-invasive prenatal paternity test, as she had to wait until the baby was born to find out it was Mark Darcy's baby. But in real life, she could have just come to Northgene and we would have told her from 8 weeks into pregnancy that it was Mark Darcy who was the father, but I guess that wouldn't have been such an exciting plot, would it?
I don't think I've ever talked about Bridget Jones's Baby in the Today's Family Lawyer podcast, so that's a first for us, Charlotte. You talk about prenatal paternity. What kind of test? We said at the outset, we're going to talk about what sort of cases come across the family lawyer's desk where they're thinking, okay, I need to think about instructing a test here. What sort of cases are you instructed on?
I'd say our top 3 examples at the moment would be your standard court-ordered paternity DNA test, in which the parentage is being disputed. And then we've seen an increase in demand for prenatal paternity cases, in which social workers and local authorities are involved. And then what has really significantly increased lately is the demand for DNA evidence for parental orders for babies born via surrogacy. So we'd prove paternity of or maternity of the intended parents. In court proceedings, our results clearly and unambiguously established biological paternity of the child, which is fundamental when parentage is being disputed. By us proving or disproving paternity, it facilitates the correct biological father obtaining legal parental responsibility of the child. And ultimately, it determines any financial support that the child might be in receipt of. And then, like I said, traditionally, family courts have waited until after the child was born to address any issues regarding parentage. However, since we've launched our Ministry of Justice prenatal paternity testing, it's given them more opportunity to resolve these issues as early as into 8 weeks into pregnancy. So cases involving social services and local authorities can accelerate the care preparation and the safeguarding of the child and prevent the child from going straight into the foster care system or staying in hospital longer than necessary. And then in terms of DNA evidence for parental orders, the number of children who've been born through surrogacy in the past decade in the UK has quadrupled. So we're seeing a massive increase in demand for DNA tests to facilitate the transfer of the legal rights from the surrogate over to the intended parents. So people come to us and we'll prove that at least one of the intended parents is genetically related to the child. And that means that they can successfully apply for the parental order. And then without doing a DNA test, if you didn't do the DNA test, it would mean you'd have to go through the complex and intrusive adoption process. So it just simplifies for the child, obviously, and then for the intended parents.
Yeah, that's super interesting there. I've not particularly sort of thought of the surrogacy route as a growing area for you guys, but yeah, I mean, we've certainly seen the statistics around surrogacy and some of those numbers that you talked about in terms of quadrupling. That's obviously a lot of demand there. We've talked in previous podcasts with other organizations not too dissimilar to yourself, specifically around sort of drug and alcohol testing, and the reliability of some of those tests being a little bit not hit and miss, but the tests being used as part of a sequence of evidence, if you like. They're not a silver bullet. DNA testing, on the other hand, is absolutely unequivocal, though, is it?
Yeah. So in family law, DNA testing and drug and alcohol testing are both used as scientific evidence, but they do have different levels of reliability and biological certainty. So legal DNA test, I'd say, is considered as conclusive evidence, whilst drug and alcohol testing is more indicative and it needs an expert interpretation to understand the results. For example, for Northgene to conclusively say that a potential father is the biological father of the child, the probability of paternity must be 99.99% or higher. And then for us to exclude a potential father, the probability threshold needs to be equal to or less than 0.1%. So you don't need an expert opinion to interpret them outcomes. You just need our expert team to determine them for you.
So talk us through what a DNA test involves? How does it work? Because we've said we've got the case that's come across our desk, whether it's court ordered or whether it's sort of voluntary. Where do we go from here as the family lawyer, and what is the role of Northgene? How does it all work, Charlotte?
Yeah, so the term DNA testing itself can be applicable to, ancestry testing, health and well-being testing, and forensic testing. But for the purpose of our legal DNA relationship tests, it's often to confirm biological relationships in court proceedings. We use something called short tandem repeat profiling. So you might hear me call it STR profiling, which is the gold standard method for establishing biological relationships. It's highly accurate and it's completely reliable, as it only focuses on parts of the DNA that are unique to every individual, except for twins, of course, identical twins, which we also do. In terms of the process itself, I'd say there's 3 main steps for a legal DNA test. The first step would be the sample collection. So this is applicable to any legal DNA test. The samples need to be collected by an independent third party. The Northgene use a UK-wide sample collector network just to make the process a bit more efficient and a bit more simple for the participants as well. Basically, at point of sample collection, we'll make sure that we obtain appropriate consent as defined by the Human Tissue Act 2004. And then the sample collector will take a clear photograph of the individuals providing a DNA sample, and they'll also verify any government photo ID available presented by the donor. It is then the collector's responsibility to provide a signed declaration alongside the photograph and the consent form and verified ID, confirming that this person they took the sample of is of true likeness of the donor they actually took the sample of. So that's such an important part, and that's the main difference between a legal court-approved DNA test and an at-home peace of mind DNA test where you can just take the samples yourselves. For a legal DNA test, there needs to be absolutely no doubt that the samples we are testing and reporting on have come from the people they should come from. And then following that, samples are sent back to us by tamper-evident and tracked means, and then they get processed in a laboratory. I won't bore you with all the sciencey details, but we extract the DNA and then we amplify the specific STR regions millions of times. And it's that amplified DNA that we process on a genetic analyzer with the resultant data used to generate the statistical reports. I guess everyone should know, I hope, that a child's DNA consists of 50% of mums and 50% of dads. So when we're doing our statistical analysis, we're determining the likelihood of that child inheriting half of their DNA from the tested potential father. I think one thing to note is that sometimes you might request to include mum's sample in a DNA test as well, even when there's no doubt that she is the mum. And it's just good practice to do that, I'd say, because it allows us to remove the DNA that the child has inherited from mum and solely focus on the DNA the child's inherited from the potential father.
How long does it take? How long does that sort of process, not necessarily the collection process, sample process, I mean, that, how long's a piece of string, I guess, but how long does the actual sort of laboratory side of things take?
Say hello to Moneypenny. We're you when you can't be. Answering calls and qualifying leads, booking appointments, updating your case management system. We handle it all just like you would, with brilliant people, AI, or both. Visit moneypenny.co.uk today.
So at the moment, we are issuing our results next working day. So from receipt of samples at our lab, I've got an incredible team, and they just get them processed and, work really hard. So we've been able to actually reduce our turnaround time lately. We used to offer 3 working days, but now we do next day results. It's just a case of, samples processed in a lab and then checking the data and writing reports.
Certainly in the course of previous podcasts, we've talked about that whole chain of custody being absolutely critical to the whole process, because of course you simply do not want or need any contamination.
No, it's completely fundamental for a legal DNA test. So, like I said, we receive our samples back in a tamper-evident envelope. At point of receipt, we inspect it to make sure there's no evidence of any tampering. If there is, we refuse to test the sample. And then samples are taken into the lab and processed as per our accredited procedures. But I think it is so important people to understand the difference of a peace of mind DNA test and a legal DNA test, because our name is down as a Ministry of Justice accredited laboratory, which we are, but that is only applicable to our legal DNA tests, where we have the strict chain of custody evidence. A peace of mind DNA test, we send the kits out, they go to the home address for them to take their own samples. And we do always recommend that you witness each other taking a sample, but ultimately we can't guarantee that the samples we're reporting on are from the intended participants. So yes, we're Ministry of Justice accredited, but that is only for our legal DNA tests. Well, I think it's important to also still offer a peace of mind DNA test, because there are times when a person might just do it out of personal curiosity or for private reassurance, and it just gives them a cheaper alternative to get the results that they want without having to go down a legal route. But I think, it's important to understand that it is for peace of mind and they're not approved for use in court.
I've certainly come across cases, and listeners to the podcast will be aware we have sister publications in private client and estate planning and conveyancing, and certainly come across cases where, let's say there's a dispute around a will or a probate case, and somewhere along the line there's some sort of familial testing that needs to be done to ensure that this person is the rightful heir and recipient and beneficiary of the estate.
So a lot of people come to us when they are going through a dispute with inheritance claim or with wills and probate, because we can confidently give them the scientific evidence to prove a biological relationship or not, which then will obviously help with their dispute and hopefully move that forward. And every time I talk about this as well, I'm always so conscious that I need to add my dad to my birth certificate. I need to do a DNA test to do that. So if anyone knows any good DNA testing companies, obviously I can't use ourselves.
What about things like consent and age restrictions, and thinking sort of about some of the legislative side of this? I mean, if courts ordered it, that's one thing, but are there age restrictions and consent issues that you need to be thinking about?
So regardless of whether you choose a legal DNA test or a peace of mind DNA test, we have to abide by the Human Tissue Act 2004, which makes it a criminal offence to test someone's DNA without their informed consent. And if for a child under the age of 16, we need someone with parental responsibility to sign a consent form for us to test their DNA. And I think it's also important to note that it is a criminal offence to impersonate or assist in the impersonation, or to even proffer another sample for DNA analysis from the wrong participant, which obviously with a legal DNA test where it's a third party doing a sample collection, that will never be an issue. But for peace of mind DNA tests, it's something to be conscious of in case potential father actually gets his best friend to take the DNA sample, and the results, aren't what you expected because there wasn't that independent third party taking a sample.
And alongside some of those age and consent concerns, we talked at the top of the podcast about some of the ethical considerations that might go into DNA testing. And of course, this is things like potentially separating families or even forcing people together who might not want to be sort of associated with one another. What kind of ethical considerations do you come up against?
I'd say the biggest ethical consideration for DNA relationship testing is the argument of truth versus the argument of stability. So, it argues that every child has the right to know their biological heritage and, to have an understanding of their medical history and just to have their own sense of self and to know who they actually are biologically. However, if, for example, a social father is found out not to be the biological father, this could impact the child's life considerably. I'd say ultimately, the decision on whether to conduct a DNA test for legal purposes should be made solely in the best interests of that child. And it's once that decision has been made that it is with Northgene to ensure that the samples are taken in accordance with the Human Tissue Act 2004 and that the samples are processed and reported on swiftly with the strict accordance to our accredited procedures. Because if the courts had determined that it's in the best interest to conduct a DNA test for that child, then for us at Northgene, it's our utmost priority to provide unambiguous, clear and accurate results to ensure the child's, lifelong welfare from our results.
Yeah, it's tough, isn't it? And I come across this in the context of family law quite regularly. And at the end of the day, it's never the family lawyer's role or responsibility to be the arbiter of morality. It's really just to decide, what the decision is in the eyes of the law, isn't it?
I think so, and I think it's good to have options as well. So you've got, your list of Ministry of Justice accredited laboratories. So there's always multiple options you can go to for your DNA testing. Unlike drug and alcohol, where you might have to do multiple rounds of testing to get a result that is helpful. For us, you just need to go to anyone on that list and get a definitive answer.
I think that's probably a useful place to finish the discussion. And just kind of in summary, whereas previous podcasts we've talked about drug and alcohol testing and its role and some of the ambiguities around it, what I've taken away from today, Charlotte, is that DNA testing is much more definitive, offers much more clarity, and in the case of Northgene, clearly offers some element of speed as well to the decision-making process. So it's been great to have you on and kind of exploring a bit about DNA testing. Thank you so much for sharing your insight.
Thanks so much, David, for having me on. It was really great to have the opportunity to talk about Northgene and how far we've come and how our legal DNA testing or paternity services can, help within the court proceedings and do so with the best interests of the child, of course. Thank you.
The Today's Family Lawyer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk. My thanks to Charlotte. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.